word. And so I've asked Luke Hendrix to come and talk to us right at the beginning about mission. And he's going to develop that a little bit.
Good evening. It's good to be here. It's been a little bit of a while since I've been here in this position in any form or fashion, but it's good to be with you this evening. There's probably a lot to say in relationship to just personally where I'm at in this whole situation. Let me just say this much. From a spiritual perspective, my formation really did come from being involved in a very small CB church out in Prineville, Oregon. And as a very young, newly married, new to the whole fatherhood situation, it was a very old church that kind of nurtured me in spiritual formation. And I'm grateful for that. And one of the things that has been prevalent as it relates to conservative Baptists and anything involving the movement there has been an emphasis on this idea that there's always been, in the vernacular of CB terms, an emphasis on soul winning. And soul winning, for my mind's sake, going back now some 30 plus years, really had the idea of proclaiming the gospel and proclaiming to those that needed to hear. We've changed our terms. Things change and shift, and now we're heavied up on the idea of mission. And I understand that, and I understand that it takes new language for new ears. And so that soul winning, or winning in general, has kind of a weird connotation to it at this point in time. So we've changed a little bit of the language, but the thought and the emphasis remains the same. This evening, what I'd like to do is maybe just give you a picture into what this has been as it relates to the heart of God for a very long time. And I'm going to use a rather obscure passage to perhaps illustrate this. So if you've got a Bible, I'm just going to ask you to stick a finger in 2 Kings in about chapter 18. I'm not going to try and move through 2 chapters of Scripture, but I am going to have you just stick your finger there, and perhaps maybe at a later time you can go back and filter through this. The seminal thought here is that the sense of mission is one that was born in the heart of God, and it legitimately is manifest in Christ's incarnation. Here is a God of the universe that's created everything, that wants to connect with His creation, and sends His Son incarnate as a human being to interact with human beings. So there's probably a lot that we could do to define mission, but let me just say this much. It really is at the heart of God to try and connect with His creation. And now, as the image bearers of this God, we do the same thing today, trying to connect with those that He has created. I'm going to steal some information and some thoughts from others who have thought deeply on this issue. Perhaps some of you are familiar with Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament theologian, and pretty much at the end of his career. And you may not agree with everything that he has to say, but there's no doubting that as an Old Testament scholar, he is perhaps the most preeminent Old Testament scholar alive today. And he argues that the cultural conditions of today, that is, of a post-modernity, require that the church function as a bilingual community. It's an interesting thought, but that we would need to be conversant in 2 different languages. And let me just try and frame that up for you. One of the languages is our language, the language of the people of faith, the people of God. It is the Christian language, if you will. And you know it well, right? You know the terms and the words. I have a son who leads worship, and he was saying to me the other day, he said, you know, Dad, it's one of the most frustrating things in the world to try and write new worship music, primarily because we use the same 50 words in worship music. And it's difficult to do. And it feels like we need to break out of that. But I want to at least applaud and acknowledge that this language within Christianity is absolutely necessary. It is a Christian language that describes us, and we need to be conversant in both that, the traditions of the church, and then we need to be conversant in the dominant narrative of the dominant culture of our day. And this is where it gets a little tricky, because we have not always focused on this. In fact, as conservative Baptists, we have kind of set our mind to, at least initially in our formation, set our mind to the idea that we were actually in a different position than the dominant culture. We wanted to say, we're trying to conserve some aspects of the truth, and we are not trying to get involved with the world, but really trying to distance ourselves, and maybe even from Christianity at some level, the liberal side of Christianity, whatever that means. But we were conserving some of that truth and trying to say we're trying to hold on to that. And it forces us back into our own language, and there's nothing wrong with our language and its traditions. We need to hold on to that. But in order for us to be image bearers to the world, we do need to be conversant in the dominant language and culture of the day. And that's a very different situation. Metaphorically, this bilingualism lies at the heart, really, of God's mission. And as I said earlier, this is the incarnation, God becoming what He loved, which was His creation, you and I. So it's from this story in 2 Kings that I want to just try and paint this picture. I have to do this very fast, so we can't just kind of work through the verses. But if you're familiar with the story at all, Assyria is marching through Israel, a split kingdom, north and south. They've already conquered all of the north. They've taken down Samaria, the capital, and they have walked through every known nation then on earth. And they are knocking on the door of Jerusalem. It's a pretty wicked scene. They have gathered around the city, around Jerusalem. And the wall around the city is the only thing that now stands between the Jews, the people of God, and the culture that seems destined to overwhelm them. It's a crazy picture. And Hezekiah is on the throne at this point, and it's a pretty dire situation. What to do? The Assyrian negotiator comes close up to the city. And he's before he even gets to the wall, announces that, hey, we have some news and some information for the people of Jerusalem. And Hezekiah sends out a team to meet them. And without going into great deal, they meet there, and the Assyrians are basically saying, hey, you're going down, and your God isn't going to be able to help you, and we're going to take you out completely. It gets very graphic, in fact. Very graphic in the language and what's going to happen. So much so that the Assyrians say, hey, listen, you know what's going to happen? In 3 days, here's what's going to happen. Your people, the people of God in this city, are going to be eating their own dung and drinking their own urine. Because we're going to cut you off completely, and we are going to overwhelm you. And if you don't believe it, just look at the rest of the kingdoms that we've walked through already. And no one can deny us. It's a pretty harrowing situation. Interesting, they're away from the wall, and the group that Hezekiah sends out, they're cognizant of that, and they say, hey, keep speaking to us in Aramaic. Don't speak to us in Hebrew, because we don't want the guys on the wall or anybody close to the wall to hear what you're saying. Then, of course, what do the Assyrians say to that? Yeah, they just want to ride right up to the wall and declare all of this in front of all the Jewish people. And to throw down hard and to say, you should be afraid, you should be very afraid. Well, the conversations that are occurring are two different conversations. There's a conversation behind the wall that is occurring with the Jewish people, the people of God. And it's very fascinating to go back and read chapters 18, 19, and 20 and to listen to the whole of the conversation. But the conversation behind the wall is in Hebrew, the language of the people of God. And they speak very openly there, and they grieve openly. And they also recount the stories of their God, the stories of God's faithfulness, remembering that their salvation is in God or Yahweh's hands, and speaking that back and forth to each other. Behind the wall, the people of Judah remember who they are. Yahweh promised to save them and make them a blessing to all the nations. And they recount those stories under Hezekiah's leadership. There's a very different conversation occurring at the wall. I'll just remind us all that this conversation behind the wall is very necessary. Any community that wants to sustain itself for any length of time must have space behind the wall to tell its own narrative and imagine its own future in relationship to that narrative. That's crucial. And I think as conservative Baptists, what I know, what I've been privy to, we're pretty good with that story. The conversation behind the wall are conversations that are decisive, but they are decisive for the conversation on the wall, where the dominant culture is meeting the very culture and the people of God. So this really now becomes an issue of worldview. That's what this sense of mission becomes. Remembering God's faithfulness, Judah's leaders enter the on-the-wall conversation with different assumptions about the world than those of the empire. The dominant culture would say, there isn't a God, or certainly your God is not the most powerful, and you have no future, and we'll decide what your future is. I want you to think of that in modern terms. Just let your imagination go wild here for a second. What does that look like? This conversation at the wall has a very different worldview than the one going on behind the wall. But if you're steeped in your own story and your own narrative with its own assumptions about what the future holds, then it's a very different conversation on the wall. People are solid, foundationally sound, they're confident and secure, and they're not afraid of what's coming at them. And this allows them to negotiate on the wall, using a language of the dominant culture. They're emboldened by an alternative vision of what the future holds. So, really, taking part in both conversations is what we want our people to do. We want them to be steeped in the traditions of the church and our God, and the faithfulness and everything that goes along with that. But we want them to be confident, to meet the dominant culture at the wall, not to shrink back, not to pull away and say, we just have to create it higher and bigger and thicker. The world cannot penetrate. And quite frankly, the Christian community and perhaps the conservative evangelical community has been hard at work at that, trying to wall out culture, trying to say there's no way for us to carry on a conversation because it's just way too dominant. So we'll shrink back and just build our walls higher. And yet, the God of the universe has not decreed that. In fact, He's shown in His Son the exact opposite. That He would send His Son and He would enter into our world, would actually tent with us, tabernacle with us in the dirt and all the messiness and all that is the dominant culture's ways. That's what God Himself decided to do. And the church must follow Christ. And Christ has given that example. But I'll go you one step further. It's not just an example we follow, but we follow an absolute finished work of Jesus Christ. And if our people don't understand that, then security is difficult. It's hard to have a conversation at the wall. It's hard to engage that dominant culture if we're not absolutely secure in our future. So that's why that conversation and different language needs to occur. But we also need to say and prep our people for what the conversation is in the language of the culture of today. What is that language? What does it look like? God calls us to converse fluently. And I'm of the mindset now, and I would say this to you very boldly, that for us, this is crucial for the people of faith. This is crucial for our very formation as followers of Christ. It must result in a bilingual consciousness. Otherwise, I do not think we're being formed truly as Christians. So God calls us to converse fluently from behind the wall, using all of our distinctive language, perception, and assumptions. Not taking anything away from that. But we also have to take part in a conversation at the wall with the dominant culture, which requires a competence in the language, perceptions, and assumptions of the broader culture. We have to have that competence. We can't hide. We have to engage. We have to know what their language is. What are their hurts? What are their concerns? What do they have hang-ups with? How could we speak in such a way that they will be able to hear? Not backing up. The controlling conversation is ours. It's the one behind the wall. And if we lose that, if we lose our language, then we're going to concede to the dominant culture. And the church will always be in a role to critique culture. Always. The idea here, though, is that we have truth and an understanding from God Himself. We don't have to bang the drum and tell everybody how false they are initially, but to engage them in their language, to reach a place of understanding at that level. A place where we can actually have a conversation. If ours is not secure, then the empire will prevail. So, modern day Assyrians. What are the modern day Assyrians for us? What do they look like? What does the dominant culture look like? Do you have any ideas? You can even shout them out. What is the dominant language of today? What you see on TV? It's all about marketing? Yeah. Could very well be. It could be the media. Could be caricatures of Christianity. It could be those that are using culture to force a new way. I have a son that spent a week at Sundance, the film festival in Park City. And he came away just absolutely blown away by being involved. And he was there with another church buddy, planting a church in Salt Lake City, and they're kind of running at this thing together, and came to the understanding that this is where popular culture gets formed, at Sundance. This is where all of the shape of culture starts for the year. And what's going to be in and out, and what the conversation is going to be. We have to be conversant in that and understand who's doing the shaping. Then, how do we engage the conversation with the dominant culture, with the empire? What do we do? Here's the tough part. Now I have to speak to you anecdotally. I left full-time service with Northwest CB in 2008. I'd already been on staff at Imago Dei Community for about a year and a half in a part-time position. And in 2008, went full-time. So now, to a great degree, I'm wholesale slotted back into the local church. It's an urban church. It's in Portland. Is everybody looking at me? Do I look like a Portlander to you? Yeah, you think so? That's interesting. I have never felt like I looked like one. And I've never felt like I've talked like someone from Portland. Now some of you are going, yes you do. Yes you do, you sound like that. I understand that, but you just need to see it from my perspective. It was very different. And Imago Dei was a young church when I started there, 2001. My wife and I would walk in and say, man, we're the oldest people here. And I think we're still pretty close to being the oldest people there. It's kind of crazy. I don't look and feel that way, but I've been completely immersed in the local church. And now my stories come from a local church position. And I told Jerry, I said, what? I can't tell stories from LeGrand, and I can't tell stories from Prineville or Roseburg or Seaside. I can tell them from Portland. He said, that's okay, Luke. We'll give you grace. I said, thank you. So what does it mean to engage? 3 simple things that Imago has tried to identify and say, here is how we engage. The first one is simply to say, we will be a church that makes disciples. Well, that's really novel, isn't it? Really novel, great terminology. We're being just so up to date. Make disciples. What does that mean? Three things that we've tried to identify. We would do everything we could to cause the people that are interested at all to embrace what Christ has accomplished for them. Number one. Secondly, that we would take those people and show them that this embracing of what Christ has accomplished is worthy of reordering your entire world around the gospel. Not to have any separation or segregation, but reorder your whole world around that gospel. So this first part is embracing the narrative, embracing our language. The second part is understanding that there's no segregation. No part of your life is exempt from the gospel. Thirdly, as it relates to making disciples, we would ask them to steward their lives for the glory of God. Basically saying you've been gifted and you need to give that away. That's why God gave you the gift. So, really simple. Believe, respond, and display. That's what we defined as a disciple. Let me move really quickly. The second emphasis was to serve the world. Serve the world. The third was to plant churches. So Imago's committed to making disciples, serving the world, and planting churches. Here's a brief little picture of what it looks like to serve the world. Because this is where we're going to find evangelism and all kinds of other words in our language that you know really well. But here's what I need you to know. We're trying to say to our people, the first thing you do in serving the world is be hospitable. Do you know what that means? Invite someone over to dinner. That's what that means. In your neighborhood. Invite your neighbors to your table. It's the most missional thing you can do. For before you can know the language of the culture, you're going to have to listen to it. You're going to have to hear what your neighbors are saying and where they live. And it starts at your table. You think I'm joking? I'm not joking. I'm talking about your own kitchen table. That's where mission starts. Invite somebody over to dinner. It could be somebody even inside the faith. That's okay. Somebody at your church. I learned hospitality from a church that knew how to throw potlucks. Serious potlucks. They were awesome. I relished those days. It's crazy. It starts at your table. It started with the table for Jesus. That's where he started it, at a table. Do justice. It's the second thing. Do justice. Comes right out of Micah. What is it for you, man? What do you need to do? Well, you're to do justice. What's that look like? Well, here's the deal. Your own people know what's best when it comes to justice. They do. Okay, so let me talk as a pastor to pastors. We don't trust them. It's the bottom line. We don't trust that they know how to do justice. So we'll come up with a plan. At Imago, we're holding on to this one tightly. It's hard. You got to fight it off with the big stick. Got lots of staff, and staff's got lots of ideas and how to reach the people and how to do justice. And to the staff, I will say on a weekly basis, none of your ideas. We will not use your ideas. Zip your mouth. What do the people say? Where will they engage the culture? What will they do? And it's crazy what they come up with. Oh, they got plans for homelessness. Medical clinics. Watched a mother, 7 months pregnant, 9 months pregnant, delivering a baby, launch a medical clinic at Imago Day. Just a mom. We have doctors. We have lots of doctors at the church. And RNs and all that. This was a mom who was pregnant. Crazy. Abby Haskins. Sing her praises. Because she launched a clinic for indigenous people around the church to have medical care. Entering the conversation on the wall. And she garnered and gathered all kinds of doctors and nurses. And they give one Saturday a month to serve. Who knows where it's going to go? Sex trafficking. Just a little girl in Imago who said, I work for the Sexual Assault Resource Center. It's not faith-based. It's community-based, but we're trying to help those that are involved in this whole awful human trafficking condition. I would like for my church to be involved. Can you help? Yes, we can. How about foster care? Just a couple that stepped up and said, we'd like to offer a night out for those people that are taking in foster kids. They can just bring them to the church, we'll watch them for a night, and they can just go out for a night. Think that's not missional? Think the state of Oregon isn't interested in that? It's crazy. We weren't the first to do that. They've been doing it in Salem for a while. Churches, been organized, been doing it. It's happening now because people are starting to do justice, to serve the orphans and the widows. Well, you know, those biblical terms, the language that we know, just putting it out there into the dominant culture. It's the foster care system. Ministry to prostitutes on 82nd Avenue. Just a meal in a warm place. Bicyclists in Portland. You been to Portland recently? Yeah, lots of them. I ride a bike. It's great. Had somebody step up and say, like to form a group? We'd like to write a paper from a Christian perspective on bicycles in Portland. You think, oh, that's really stupid. Who cares? It's crazy. It's a war zone there between drivers of cars and bicyclists. You'd think it wouldn't be, but it is. Music and art and a third space. We have an art gallery downtown. We have to pay money to rent the building, the space. It's a loft. Some would say, oh, that's unbelievably extravagant. The curator happens to be a guy who teaches at PNCA, an art college there in Portland. He wanted to create a space for artists of the city and Christian artists to meet and for their art to mingle and for a conversation to begin. It's there. Been operating for a couple years. Ministry to addicts and this whole idea of just kind of a mission retool for overseas missions. Could go on and on. To do justice, to show mercy. This is one where I had to go to school. Lead pastor Rick McKinley had an idea that when Imago got started, it went after a grassroots kind of justice from the bottom up. And he said, it's not enough. We got to go from the top down. And I'm like, I don't want to mess around with the top. I'm just happy to work with our people and work from the bottom up. And he said, no, look, we got to go from the top down. You got to think bigger. Could you show mercy to a whole city? And I don't have enough time to explain to you. But it's happened. Gifting the city with dollars collected from multiple churches, taking it to the mayor of Portland and saying, you do what you want with this money. It's from the Christian community in Portland. And we believe in the city and we want the city to prosper. What do you need done? First openly gay mayor in Portland, in a major city in the U.S., receiving a check from the pastors of Portland for $125,000, and he doesn't know what to do. Every news organization in the whole of Portland is there. All the TV cameras, newspapers, everybody's there to watch him receive this check. He's new to the office of mayor, and he's embroiled in a scandal, and he doesn't know what to say. And he can't really believe that pastors have embraced him and are giving him this check. You know what's crazy? It's crazy. Not one news organization presented the story. Mum's the word. We're not telling this story. Is that crazy? Made me mad. But you have to think bigger. You have to think about a city, a whole city, and trying to love a community. So you show mercy and proclaim the gospel. A few years ago, Rick said, it's real simple. We're going to put buckets up front. You come up when you take communion and put $1 in the bucket. We'll take the $1, put them all together, and weekly, we'll go give this to someone outside of our church community. And we're just going to see how much change God can bring with $1. We call it change for $1. I think Rick stole it from somebody. It's okay though, right? It's a good idea. And our people, here's what our people have to do. They have to surface where the money goes on a weekly basis. They got to submit and say, I know a need. But here's the deal. When they surface the need, they're the ones that have to take the money back and tell the story. They have to proclaim who their God is and who is motivating them. And then they have to stand up in front of the congregation and tell the story. And they're shaken, right? Like, I went and it was my neighbor and they needed help and I didn't know what to do and we had this money and we could help them do this. And they need to tell their story of God, how God's transformed their lives. And now how this community who doesn't even know this person wants to love them. Proclaim the gospel. And I'm way out of time. Jer, sorry. You're in big trouble with preachers. I am so sorry, bro. Let me finish with this. Plant churches, okay? This is us. This is what we've committed to. But here's the bottom line. I have sons. They're busy planting a church. They don't do church the way I would do church. Heck, Rick doesn't do church the way I would do church. Let's just be honest. I got a particular way or thought. But here's the deal. The language that we share is the same. And the commitment is the same. And we have to be able to release it to the next generation. And empower them immediately. And I've watched that over and over at Imago Dei Community. Give this thing away. Give it away. The people know where the justice needs to be done. They know how to show mercy. Empower them and watch as the leaders pop. As they pop, equip them. Train them, send them. Plant the churches that God wants in communities. Because the only conversation worthy of having is the one around Jesus Christ. That's the only conversation worth having. And it's got to be said in a language that the people will hear. So we're going to have to engage the dominant culture. I pray that that's what our future will be. Grateful for the opportunity to be here and hopefully to encourage you. Thanks.